Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Say Again with me, Amrita Tripathi. I'm so happy to bring you today a conversation with Colin Crowell, a public policy expert. He's the global managing director of the Blue Owl Group, an international tech policy consultant, and host of the Winging It podcast. Maybe my favorite avatar of yours, Colin. Thanks so much for joining us from Washington and for taking the time out.
It's a delight to be with you, Amrita.
So we're going to cover a few big themes, I think, Colin, in this conversation. And, usually towards the back half, we talk a little bit about, the sort of leaders or change makers' own journeys. But to kick off, I'd love to dive straight in by asking you to, help us make sense of some headlines, because one of the buzziest, pieces of news in this sort of tech Gen AI space right now is regulations, is what's coming down the pipeline. And it's not necessarily something everyone's privy to. You have, of course, you have a ringside view to a lot of what's going on. So a couple of the headlines, which I will, add in post. One is the Indian finance minister saying recently in Milan that AI regulation needs global cooperation, not isolated moves. And I'm going to just juxtapose that with what we're seeing out of the US. Bloomberg saying that, tech and AI company chiefs are urging senators to tone down regulations. Fortune saying Sam Altman urging lawmakers against regulations that could slow down the US in an AI race against China. Right now, when you look at that, from the point of view of sort of the rest of the world, I mean, the non-techies really, how do we make sense of some of the sounds that are coming out? Because it seems like a new wave in the kind of conversations we've been seeing.
No, certainly. And I think if you were to go back in a time capsule to, a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, you had the so-called tech titans from Silicon Valley showing up in Washington and sitting around a table with senators, urging them to please put prophylactic guardrails in place for AI because the technology might be so dangerous that it could lead to a great calamity.
Yeah.
And there were some at that time, you may recall, urging a pause in AI development and seeking a pause so that guardrails and safeguards could be put in place before further development of AI tools and services were moved forward. So it's a 180 from that era. When you see Sam Altman and others saying, actually, it's the opposite. We think the United States should put its foot on the gas pedal and accelerate development because we're in a geopolitical race against China in particular for supremacy in AI. And that's a very different tune from a year and a half ago. And I think what you see there in the news from the Indian finance minister saying there should be global coordination, I think that's the kind of thing that probably will come over time because there are disparate approaches to AI governance occurring right now. So the European Union has passed the EU AI Act, and that's a risk-based approach to governance. It's in the process of being implemented right now in Europe. But what the Europeans may consider to be risky is probably a broader set of conditions and outcomes than, for example, in the United States, where it would be more open to experimentation and basically asking for forgiveness later rather than permission first. And then you juxtapose the European approach and the American approach, of course, with China's approach, which is a very state-directed approach to AI governance and AI development. So that coordination, particularly for entities that might want to serve multiple markets in multiple geographies will be interesting. And of course, this is the kind of thing that often needs multilateral engagement. But I don't see that occurring soon.
And is it the kind of thing which, when push comes to shove, like, for example, we saw that tech companies had to kind of, when the sort of GDPR legislation came through in Europe kind of was quite, I think, pleased and proud to take that kind of vanguard position and say we care about privacy, and so everyone has to fall into place. And just by virtue of all of these companies operating across markets, which makes things so complicated, do you see that the way it's being positioned right now, it really is being seen as a US and China race? I mean, when it comes to Gen AI, and Europe, as you said, taking a sort of different tack. Do you think that there's space in this conversation for emerging markets as well, or is this like really sort of down the line? How do you see that play out?
I do think there's space for emerging markets, and I do think there's space as well for the so-called global South in these conversations. And I think uh, the open source AI opportunities, and I think DeepSeek, which came out of China, is illustrative of that. The ability to perhaps spin up an AI application and service without the significant investment in energy infrastructure, in data center resources, in large language models, and vast consumption of data, but perhaps something that's done less expensively and can be done more quickly. These may also be the opportunities for niche services. Rather than general purpose AI models, they may be focused more on medical applications or energy applications or educational applications. And I think that open source opportunity opens a door to other players in the market because certainly the general purpose large language models, at least at this point, are consuming significant amounts of energy resources, need significant data center resources, and substantial amounts of data.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll come back to this later to ask you a little bit what what you think regular people need to know about, sort of being careful in terms of privacy, what companies need to worry about in terms of ethics. But for the moment, is there anything big you're looking for, or looking forward to this year, or is there something you're watching out for that maybe keeps you up at night? I'm not sure. At one point, it was the sentience. I think everyone was getting very, very stressed about. But how do you look at things to worry about or things that you're watching out for?
Certainly there would be risky outcomes and applications that could come from AI. To the extent to which it becomes ever more sophisticated, you would have bad faith actors perhaps putting this to ill use. And I think from that standpoint, it can run the gamut from things that pose risks to cybersecurity, to national security, but even the more pedestrian concerns about consumer fraud, deceiving ordinary people and swindling them out of their savings with very sophisticated pitches, again with ill intent.
And we were seeing earlier, I think this year, like a lot of sort of targeting of senior citizens. And I mean, at least in India, we're seeing folks trying to work on that in terms of education and awareness programs, specifically for seniors. This is clearly something that's just going to get more complicated, not less. And I don't know what this says about us, but when you said bad faith actors, my brain went immediately to our experience at Twitter. So Colin was the global VP at Twitter, and what I understood from the policy world was literally seeing you crisis manage every so often, because of course, coming from outside of tech, for example, and jokes apart, we don't always realize the scale and scope of the problem when it comes to bad faith actors, because it's not just one. You had these incredible trust and safety teams constantly trying to be a few steps ahead. Can you take us through a little bit of how you've seen that era also? I mean, at that point, when you're talking about um, asking for forgiveness, not permission, there was also this whole debate on whether sort of these massive tech platforms should have kind of seen what was coming down the pike. Were we kind of always trying to catch up to the way that this incredible tech was being misused? Can you take us through the lens of sort of public policy and what your take and perspective really has been, seeing that whole landscape evolve as well?
Well, certainly, during that era, during the 2010s, we'll say, in the Twitter 1.0 era that I was the head of global public policy, the reality was several things happening simultaneously. First, the technology itself was still rather novel. It was a different way of communicating that empowered people at the edges of the network. Traditional communications, tended to be either a controlling authority with broadcast television or broadcast radio or, major newspapers speaking, directly to the people. Or conversely, with the arrival of the internet, you had the ability of, people on the internet to speak back to controlling authorities, whether those were, sort of large corporations they were dealing with or governments. Social media allowed for this horizontal communication, people speaking to each other, sharing perspectives with each other, and people realizing that, somebody who might be on the other side of the city or the other side of the country or the other side of the world had views that were very similar to theirs. And so there were moments that really helped bridge time and space and allowed people to share, perspectives on those things. And when it worked well, Amrita, it was really quite remarkable, whether it was Black Lives Matter, whether it was the Me Too movement. Those often illuminated issues that societies had all too often swept under the rug and brought them out into the light. And people debated them, and people might have been horrified by what they were seeing, but they could comment on it, they could share perspectives. And in that sense, it was a way in which societies could move forward and advance. And engage on those perhaps thorny, difficult conversations that they had not had the opportunity or had avoided in the past. But I think it was the physicist Niels Bohr who once said that a great truth is a truth whose opposite is also a great truth. And so, as much as social media and Twitter in particular could illuminate and allow people to share perspectives, it could also very quickly advance information or content that was not informationally nutritious, not necessarily beneficial to society. And so you had abuse and harassment on the platform. You had disinformation emerge on the platform. You had terrorist and extremist groups present on the platform. And our colleagues were quite dutiful in trying to address those through policy and through enforcement on the platform, and increasingly attempting to use technology to help solve some of the problems that technology itself was posing for many of the people using Twitter and these other platforms at that time. So the ability to use sort of community notes, the augmentation of block to also include mute and muting an account, the ability to mute a conversation. All of those tools over time were designed to empower people to help navigate content that was either unwelcome or harmful. And of course, the difficult terrain for any of these companies in any jurisdiction was not the illegal content, because illegal content is pretty straightforward, cut and dry. It's the content that was not illegal, but harmful. And that was often in the eye of the beholder. Any two people in the world could look at the same content and have a different opinion about it. And certainly in a character constrained platform like Twitter, it was often difficult to discern, what that was. So from a public policy perspective, we sought to engage with civil society, with safety groups, with governments, with an attitude and openness to address issues as best as we could see, to make sure that the experience that people had on the platform was a healthy one, was an enjoyable one, while at the same time retaining as best as we could free expression principles so that we weren't unduly silencing voices that might otherwise be provocative but deserve to be heard.
Yeah, and there's so many. I think we need a separate masterclass from you on how you can, pass some of that. Because I mean, I think in different markets, we've certainly seen different approaches to freedom of speech, how far it can go. Right now, we're going through this sort of era of misinformation. The way things have changed. But I do want to take a step back and ask you a little bit more about, how public policy itself in the tech landscape has changed. If we look at your career, and if you could tell us a little bit about what you were doing before Twitter, and again, the underpinnings of this is that Colin was working on the groundbreaking legislation that really changed the way the internet was used by all of us. So that includes the Telecommunications Act of 1996, I think, in the US. It gave us that kind of the scaffolding that has been in, use ever since. At that time, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think public policy was really a career as it is now. Like, it seems like a lot has changed since then. Can you take us through a little bit about your journey there as well?
No, certainly happy to do that. I spent most of my adult life and career in government. So I did, as you mentioned, spend 20 years on Capitol Hill working as a staffer in the US Congress on the Telecommunications and Internet Subcommittee. And it was during that time in the 90s when the internet was basically changed from what had been basically a science research network run by the US government to something that was made publicly available to everyone in the world. And in those moments, a lot of the laws in the United States needed to be changed for two reasons. One reason was the arrival of the public internet. The second reason was that we had technologies in every sector shifting from analog to digital. Broadcast radio and television switched from analog to digital. Telephony switched from copper wire to fiber optics and from analog to digital. Cable television, satellites, wireless switched from analog cell phones to digital mobile phones. So the laws needed to adjust to that. Digital allowed a cross-pollination of content across communications networks. So once content became a series of zeros and ones and put in packets on the internet, it could travel across any network. So it didn't matter whether it was the telephone company or the cable company or the satellite company delivering your television show, they could all do it. Same thing with voice and the like over these networks. So in quick succession, the United States did a series of laws to break down those silos and to create a climate that was conducive to innovation and investment. And so what you had coming out of the Telecom Act of 96, the breaking down of those silos and putting on the books some new laws to take into account how the internet was going to be different from communications networks of the past. And so so-called Section 230 was enacted during that time, which allowed people to voice and share perspectives on the internet through platforms that would not be held liable for the voices of third parties, of the people using their services. And so there was a tremendous amount of investment. We had the dot-com boom and bust, but out of that came the social media era, so to speak. And that really was something then when I left the US government and I did a 2-year stint at the beginning of the Obama administration at the Federal Communications Commission, working for the chairman at that time. And we worked on net neutrality rules in the US and also our US national broadband plan during that era. But in 2011, I became Twitter's first public policy hire. And I, over almost 8.5 years, built out that function for the global team at Twitter. And then over time, I was also entrusted with the corporate philanthropy function. So we also did the Twitter for Good work at the company during that era. But it was all built upon that scaffolding that you mentioned, Amrita, that rules were put in place, guardrails were enacted, but it was, again, a climate conducive to investment, a climate conducive to the growth of the internet during that era.
It's fascinating, which is where hopefully the book comes together because you've seen these 2 or 3 eras already in this kind of like the cycle that we're in. But was it a weird transition? Was it a difficult transition to go from government to not just private sector but Silicon Valley? Or did you feel it was pretty an organic kind of change? Because I know a lot of people, 20 years is a long time. So I feel like a lot of us do these kind of mid-career transitions and it's a little bit challenging, goalposts change and so on. How was it for you?
I think if I had switched from government to a corporate entity other than Twitter, it might have been a more difficult transition. But Twitter was, in 2011, quite consonant from a public policy perspective with the orientation I had in my own personal policy compass that I had in government. So it's policies around privacy, around data protection, its orientation towards the free expression principles, defending the user's voice was very similar to consumer empowerment and sort of creating opportunities for entrepreneurial entry from a government policy perspective that I had worked on previously. So from that standpoint, it was perhaps an easier transition than if I had gone to some other big company that might have had different values. But Twitter's values sort of fit me hand in glove in 2011. And so the transition was less about going from government to corporate culture than East Coast to West Coast orientation here.
I feel like it's been explained to me as Delhi to Mumbai sometimes, which you know all too well
Yes.
how we feel about these things.
Totally, quite similar. Yes.
And so now you've set up the Blue Owl Group. You're the global managing director. So I'd love to ask you a little bit about that journey. The landscape has changed, and folks we've worked with or have seen will note that the restraint with which I'm not asking about X or to comment on that. I think we're seeing a lot of changes still happen there. So never say never. Maybe later this year, but. How has it been to set up your own consulting group? You're still working internationally. You're still working on issues you really care about. Take us through a little bit about this sort of phase of your journey.
Well, one of the things that happens when you work with people in one job and you trust them you respect them, and you enjoy working with them, is you kind of harbor this hope that you'll have an opportunity to work with them again in the future. And so the Blue Owl Group is that opportunity for me and for my colleagues, because we all worked together previously at different points in time at Twitter. So we were all members of the Twitter public policy and policy communications team. And we came together as a collective because we all realized in our markets, we were all kind of starting to do something very similar in consulting on tech policy issues and the issues that we cared about. This is our opportunity to kind of stay the course, so to speak, with what brought us all to Twitter in the first place, which was a love of technology, a real interest in public policy, and in this world, you have to like politics. If you don't like politics, if you don't find it interesting, if you don't consider it kind of a sport, you're not going to enjoy working in public policy. So from that standpoint, we've come together, and we do a lot of the similar work we did in the past on public policy engagement and advisory services and policy communications all together as a package. But we're not solely looking at the future through a rear view mirror and just working on social media issues, because we're also actively engaged in content issues, in AI in particular, in open source technology and green tech and those sorts of things. So we're eager to embrace the geopolitical context of the current era and do our best with the partners with whom we work.
It's incredible because you've also seen, I think, firsthand, so many of the things. You and the team have seen so many of the, I think, some of the complications and the ramifications of what's happening in this kind of global interconnected system. So you can see some of the challenges that would also arise. I do want to ask you, Colin, over the course of your career, have you changed the way you look at success and failure? I think this is something that comes up a lot nowadays, especially with startups, especially with founders. How do you define success or failure? Is there anything you'd like to share with us, or any anecdotes you can share on lessons learned along the way?
Yeah, my experience, born through my career, is that on the political side, the political pendulum tends to swing back and forth. It feels like it's swinging wildly in both directions in recent years. But I think from a public policy perspective, when you look at politics, whether it's here in the United States or really anywhere, engaging with people with whom you might not necessarily agree philosophically in your approach to public policy issues, and finding the contours of that Venn diagram area of overlap where you can agree, and focusing there allows policymakers and people engaged in public policy, stakeholders of all type, to put in place laws and regulations that stand the test of time. Because my experience is that if one side runs up the score because they happen to have power right now, and runs up the score ignoring some of the concerns of the other side, of other perspectives, well, when the pendulum swings back, the other side's going to be raring to go and will be eager to reverse everything that one side put on the books and enacted into laws or regulations. Whereas if you find that Venn diagram overlap, if you find areas of mutual interest and mutual concern and address those, they're less likely to be overturned when the other side reclaims political power. And I think that leads to stability, and it leads to progress from a public policy standpoint for consumers, for citizens, for corporate actors, for civil society, and for the political actors themselves. Because when you then reclaim power, you're not working on everything all over again. You're just working on the new things, the things that you felt were undone by the previous team when it was in power. And so that was the story of the 90s in the US, with all of those laws, whether it was the Cable Act of 92, Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 98, Child Online Privacy Protection Act in the late 90s, the Telecom Act of 96. Those laws were enacted during a time of divided government. It was a Republican Congress and it was a Democratic administration. Notwithstanding that, the Congress was able to work with the administration to enact those foundational laws for the internet era, which have largely stood the test of time and remain the foundational laws for this era some 25 to 30 years later. And I think that's a good lesson for political actors today as well.
And it's interesting because it feels like you've been able to take that. Like you have spoken in the past also about, the need to work both sides of the aisle. But also when you look at, right now, like the need to work locally, but also globally. I do feel like you're one of the leaders we used to see coming in, who would meet people where they were. It's not that everyone's always on the same side or philosophically, as you said, or the worldviews might not align, but you seemed to have that knack of meeting stakeholders where they were, especially in government. It's an important attribute, Colin. So, hats off to you for that. But I also think because folks in government, because they're so, mindful of their own constituents in different markets, that means different things. So is that something you've sort of cultivated in yourself, or is it just something that you happen to be good at, which is maybe stakeholder management in some other parlance? Or is it something that you've seen as you travel that it grows more and more?
I think it is something that I was cognizant of, but certainly traveling internationally helped me hone that better. I had the good fortune right after college, before I went to Washington, to work as a volunteer in Peru in South America doing social service volunteer work. And that was an eye-opening experience for me because the culture was quite different from the United States. It was certainly different from my own personal upbringing and experience up until that point. But I think in politics in particular, if you're trying to achieve compromises to advance policy goals, one thing to do is to try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And as you engage in dialogue with them, try to see the same issues you're looking at from their perspective. And in doing that, you can perhaps fashion creative ways forward so that it's not a zero-sum game, that their perspective is able to be factored into whatever the end result is. I was also cognizant, Amrita, at Twitter, when we were there together, that almost 80% of Twitter users were outside of the United States. It was a global platform, and I was cognizant of the fact at the time, as I engaged with government officials in very different markets around the world, that the contours of that line of what in the United States would be captured by the First Amendment, the First Amendment ends at the shores of the United States. And so what constitutes free expression in different cultures and different societies where the cultural and societal mores would be different. It didn't mean that one side or the other side was right or wrong. It was just a different way of looking at the same issues, given cultural perspectives that might be different. So I tried very hard to take that into account and to see things from the other person's perspective, while at the same time trying to remain principled in how we were addressing these issues for a global platform and trying to have an approach that was as consistent as possible in markets around the world.
And I think, working with internal stakeholders as much as external to explain the sort of complications and nuances there. I do want to ask you a little bit in terms of this, sort of global world we find ourselves in. I mean, right now with it's hard not to get swayed, I think, depending on whoever's picked whichever social media platform of choice. We knew echo chambers were an issue in the past. It seems to be, that seems to have like just really intensified further. When we look at issues of like ethics and privacy, and you have very strong positions on this, do you have any advice for folks? I mean, maybe even friends, I'm sure everyone comes up to you for, your take on things in terms of what we're seeing with Gen AI. Like, so from the mental health, perspective, I can tell you, I've been talking to some experts who've been like, please stop using Chat GPT, for example, as your therapist. It's not your therapist. It's not trained to, so there's a lot of safeguards that have to be built in still to sort of the way these LLMs work. People have obviously adapted and adopted these technologies, and just we're all using them. But do you have any concerns about, sort of privacy or what you'd want people to sort of keep an eye on? I think in the past we used to tell people try and read the terms and conditions. I don't think that's still happening. But is there anything you'd advise folks as we adopt these new technologies as consumers?
Yeah, I think the key thing from a consumer perspective to factor in and to try to keep in mind is that these are tools. And I think when they acquire an anthropomorphic quality to it, it can do a disservice to people because, as you point out, Amrita, they're not your therapist. They're a tool. They can illuminate information and content. They can synthesize and summarize content very well and rapidly. Uh, they still hallucinate a greater degree than most people would want to see for something that increasingly consumers will want to and may start to rely upon. And so the veracity coefficient needs to be much higher. And I think the AI companies are aware of that and trying to continue to innovate and refine their models so that they hallucinate less in the future. But consider them a tool, like any other tool. The human has to remain in the driver's seat. We can't become subservient to the tools or rely upon them too much, certainly at this point.
Until the sentience, which we'll have another whole different
Well,
conversation where we'll have the
at some point, the Cylons will turn on us and attack.
yes,
I get it.
which we will worry about till that date. Just to wind down, Colin, I feel like it would be it would be great to let people know also. I mean, having seen you lead teams, I have two final questions for you. I know your teams love you, and I think that's something that transcends like the company sort of organization, like that, the sort of relationship in that capacity. How have you sort of become the best leader you can be? Are there any leadership principles that you have tried to follow? And where do you index on sort of empathy or compassion when it comes to leadership? I think times are getting more and more complicated. We've gone from, I think, VUCA to BANI to all of these kind of acronyms, but life is pretty complicated right now in any work environment. What's sort of guided you in terms of your leadership model?
I think, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that, Amrita. I think for me, one of the ways to be a successful leader, and one of the tactics I think I successfully employed, was in the first instance, I overhired. And I overhired by, bringing in some of the most talented people into the social media public policy sphere. And I did that in part by over interviewing and having lots of conversations and making sure I was talking to people from different career paths. One of the notable things I think about the Twitter public policy team and the way I approached hiring there was that previous tech policy experience was not the most valuable or important quality I was looking for in a candidate. In a public policy team, you're generally looking for people who, at least on the Myers-Briggs scale, are more extroverted than introverted because it's a public-facing role. But the quality you're most eager to hire for is judgment, knowing when to speak, knowing when to remain silent and listen more than speak, quality of judgment to know that a person who is working on the team with me who might be half a world away and engaged in something timely when I'm asleep will, in the first instance, approach it in a very sensible way. And so first was overhiring and bringing in quality people. The second thing was recognizing that when you hire eminently qualified people with good, sound judgment, you have to entrust them to do the job. And that was the final thing for me, which was I tried to manage the team and I tried to manage my colleagues the way I would want to be managed if the situation were reversed. And the way I would want to be managed is I would want to be treated like an intelligent adult, entrusted to do the job I was hired to do. And if you build that trust, then your team communication tends to be robust. People can come to you with problems and queries, issues they're wrestling with without fear of being judged. And knowing they could bring that to me with great confidence and in confidence, and we would work collaboratively to kind of figure out a path forward. But I was blessed by having an incredibly talented team, and they helped to make me look good.
Oh, shout out to all the owls. We will definitely ensure they all listen to at least this clip, this part of it. And then final question for you, Colin. Is there anything that you're grateful for? We like to wind down with gratitude. Anything you'd like to share that you're grateful for?
Yeah, I mean, I'm grateful to the opportunity I was given as a very young Capitol Hill staffer when I similarly was thrown into working on telecommunications and tech policy issues by an elected official who's still in Congress today, Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts. And he sort of threw me into the deep end. I had no previous experience working in the national legislature, and I had no experience working on tech policy issues. But that trust and that opportunity gave me a front row seat to all of the changes that would unfold over time. And I'm forever grateful for that opportunity because it literally changed my life.
I love that. Thank you so much, Colin. Thank you. I'm grateful to you for taking this time and for sharing so much of your insight and just being such a generous leader yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amrita. This was a delight. It's so great to see you and be with you today.